The Athletic.
The Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco.
Gary redesigns F1's failed spray guards. We talk Red Bull dominance, untangle the order in the chasing pack, and answer your questions about wind tunnels and airboxes. The Hungarian Grand Prix certainly throw up its fair share of fascinating Formula One technical stories, so it's the ideal time for myself, Edd Straw, and the star of the show, Gary Anderson, to get together for another episode of the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. There's plenty for us to talk about, what with the Red Bull upgrades and some very interesting performance patterns to untangle. And Gary, the Hungaroring's always an interesting track, isn't it? So, was it one you enjoyed watching from home?
Yeah, I always enjoy Hungary. It's one of those sort of demanding circuits, where it's a real sort of old school circuit where there's runoff areas and grass and curbs, and you have to, as a driver, you have to be disciplined, and that's always very, very difficult through those long corners, turn 1, turn 2, and the last 2 corners, 180 degree. You're sitting there for a long time, middle of the corner, and basically the balance is quite important through that section, because if you have a bit of understeer, you're just waiting, you can't get on the throttle. And when you do get on the throttle, you get a snappy rear end. So it's always been demanding. It was a slower circuit, I suppose you might call it, before they lengthened the straight, which made quite a big difference to it. We talk about Monaco, being sort of dirty aero, just put a pilot on the car no matter what it does to it, really, drag-wise. Whereas Hungary is just not quite like that. It's about getting as much downforce on the car as you can, but still pretty efficient. And the big problem really is the fact that the average speed's so slow means that the cooling is an issue for brakes and for the engine, because there is no high speed parts of it that really sort of cools the car well, and so you have to run more cooling exits, which again loses some of that downforce. So it's a demanding circuit. Some people make the right decisions and some people don't, I suppose, but it's always interesting. You have to drive it. You have to drive it well, and I think once you do that, it's a completely different circuit.
Yeah, and that's what makes it one of the most interesting ones. I've always liked the Hungaroring, actually, even though it was quite unpopular at time. But I think that's why you get these quite compressed fields and sometimes get these slight surprises in qualifying and that kind of thing. But as always, we're actually going to start off with a tech topic of Gary's choice for part 1 of the podcast. So what's grabbed your attention from the world of F1 tech in the past week or so?
Well, we've heard a lot about trying to control the spray and the wet, and obviously, again, we had a bit of a wet practice session on the Friday in Hungary. So you can see how the spray gets, dissipated at the back of the car from the rear wheels and from the diffuser. Now, the FIA have been looking at some ways of doing a clip-on device, I suppose you might call it, which would allow them to run in dangerous conditions. It's one of those sort of situations where I'm not quite sure how you do it, to be honest. It's going to be very, very difficult to make a significant improvement. The bits and pieces I've seen from the FIA, I'm not 100% sure that it's where I would be heading. But at the end of the day, we have seen some catastrophic accidents. And we're heading to Spa, next week, which is obviously a circuit where you can get lots and lots of rain. It's high speed. Parts of it are blind, so that's the sort of thing that's really a problem. You need to make sure that you have as much control over that spray as possible. Otherwise, you just have to stop the race and you just can't run. So it's going to be very difficult, because these cars are massive vacuum cleaners. They suck everything up that's around them and they spit it out the back. That's why they create downforce from underneath the car. So stopping them doing that is going to be a bit of a task. I'm sure there's a percentage influence you can put on it, but I'm not sure it's as much as you really need to sort of say, okay, rain doesn't matter anymore. So we'll wait and see.
Yeah, it is very interesting, because obviously they did the test at Silverstone. It was a straight line test. They had Mercedes there with the wheel covers, and Mercedes had made some contribution to the engineering design of these, by which I mean the FIA came up with the shapes, but obviously you can come up with the shapes and the basic idea, but you actually need someone to engineer it. So that's what Mercedes was brought in to do. It doesn't mean they designed them, but more making those structures. And they ran them with Mick Schumacher, and they had Oscar Piastri there in a McLaren, which is in normal trim as a kind of control and to run in spray and all that kind of thing. It was kind of characterised as a failure, but it's the first time they'd run these. So this was very much a first attempt. But I had a chat with a couple of other journalists, with Nicholas Tombassis, the head of FIA single-seater technical matter. So he's effectively the head regulations honcho for F1, you could say. And he's been very involved in this project, doing all the CFD work, etc. And it was interesting because obviously he did allude to the fact that obviously the wheels are only part of the cause of the spray. There's also the spray that's caused coming out from under the underfloor. And obviously you have to remember that the car's going through air that is full of water droplets. And obviously simulating all that is very, very complicated once it's in the flow regime of the car. But he did say something that slightly surprised me, which was that it was more difficult than expected. And it wasn't just a case of coming up with a fairly simple design and putting it on. I must confess, purely as an interested layman on tech, I'm not an engineer, but when it was announced, I thought this is a laudable enterprise, but this is going to be quite difficult. And it surprised me to hear him say, actually, we thought this would be reasonably straightforward. They even talked about maybe having them ready for the second half of this season. And we should note these are just bolt-on parts to be used in the most extreme wet conditions to allow them to run to avoid a Spa 21. But did it surprise you that he was quite so... I don't want to use the word blasé about it, but it did surprise me. They thought it would be a quite simple endeavour. Yeah, it does a bit because, all you've got to do is drive down the motorway and you'll see what spray's about. It's from cars to trucks. And whenever you consider that there is no limitation on what people could do to a car or a truck or a van, a normal road car to reduce that spray, which is dangerous. The first thing you'll do whenever you get into heavy rain on the motorway is slow down a bit because, the spray makes it very, very difficult to see. And multiply that by, 100-fold because of the ground effect underfloor and pulling all that water in around the car. It's no surprise to me. If you just look at the way the water flows coming off the front wheels and tucks in underneath the floor, they talk about this 60, 80 litres per second of water pumping that the tyre can do. Well, that water has to go somewhere. All that water pumping is doing is concentrating it in an area so that it's, you can see it whenever you look at the wheels. It's coming out the sides and out the back as you pump the water through underneath the tyre. So containing that is going to be very, very difficult. It's a massive amount of water droplets, as you say. And I don't think it's any easy task. I'm very surprised that somebody with his level of expertise would actually make a statement like that they thought was easy. Because no matter what you do, nothing is easy. And it will always have consequences somewhere along the line. So, as I say, I think you could probably influence a certain percentage of it. But from my point of view, if you were doing a very good job, you'd be talking about 10, 15, 20% at the best of influence on that spray. You'll never, ever, make an influence of 80%. No way. Not as long as you keep on researching. So, it's not going to be easy. Well, the objective is to split the difference there because they're looking for about a 50% reduction in the spray to make it possible to see. And if you can see, provided the aquaplane is not too serious, you can race. But they're going to do a next version of them that are like to enclose the wheel more. Obviously, it's difficult in this format to show everyone what the first version looked like. If you head to the race website, there is a story I did at the weekend about them, and we'll have something from Gary later in the week that will include those. But they're basically, on all four wheels, they were two park guards. There was one kind of at 12 o'clock, and then another one sort of at 7 o'clock, if you think yourself looking at the wheel. So a two-part one. And it does seem like they're going to have to go much more enclosed in some way. And you've been having a little bit of a think, and you sent me a few sketches that you were using to aid your thinking over the weekend. So once again, using the magic of this utterly non-visual format, what would be your approach for V2 of these spray guards? Because V1 are just a no-go. They didn't, in fact, he said no tangible effect on the spray. They were that ineffective. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, if you take a normal flow around the wheel, without the fact that it's, there's all these vortices generated down the side of the car and the fact that it's ground effect underneath the car moving it. If you just take a normal wheel and put it into a wind tunnel as such and watch and look at the flow, model the flow, basically looking from the outside, the airflow up to about what we call 10 o'clock separates and goes around the side of the tyre. And down at the bottom of the tyre, what's going on the ground, you get what's called tyre squish. So in other words, the air that's between the tyre and the ground is squeezed out the sides. And then at about 10 o'clock, that airflow starts to go over the top of the tyre it basically, it separates around the tyre in the best way possible. So the void behind it
the tyre is trying to pull air over the top of the tyre, and it's trying to pull it around the sides of the tyre. And also the high pressure in front of the tyre is pushing it around the sides of the tyre. So you get a lot of movement around the sides and all trying to join up again behind the tyre, especially down in the contact patch area where the tyre is just coming off the ground, because that's the lowest pressure area. It can't get fed by very much down there to fill up that void. So it's that lower half of the tyre at the back, from the sort of axle centre line downwards, that you need to do something. And again, I sort of equate it to a bit like, what you want to do with a hover mower. You keep it low at the sides and you blow air out. But because it's down low, then, that air doesn't go everywhere. It just means that it hovers. And the same with this mudguard device. You want to get it as low to the ground as possible, but you've got to let the air and the water get out of there somehow. So, the one thing you do want to do is make the cars wider. So you can't really do much with the flow that's coming around the side of the tyre, the outside of the tyre, because that would make the cars wider. It would mean that the guys couldn't change wheels easily. So there's always the restrictions that are coming with actually achieving something. As I say, that if you're going to make an influence on it, it's that from axle centre line down to the ground, the width of the tyre, and on the inside you want to try and contain, because a lot of that airflow that's displaced by the contact patch in front of the tyre is sucked inwards to the diffuser. And that's why we got what they call this sort of mouse hole, which is giving it room to be pulled into the diffuser there. Because the one thing you can't do here is just sort of not try to allow it to do what it wants to do. You can sort of give it a bit of a shuffle and try to make it do something a little bit different, but you can't just make it do something completely different. So you need to pick up that airflow that's being displaced by the inside of the front tyre, and make sure you contain it and bring it down low into that low pressure area behind the tyre where it's coming off the ground. So it's a bit of a low down mudguard, I suppose you might call it. But I think it's possible, and I think it's possible if you were to do it so it clips onto the existing brake ducts quite easily, sort of dial fitting with a couple of mechanical fasteners. So it is actually something that you could fit on in, a minute or whatever, if you did have to do it within a practice session because it got very wet, or even during a race if they had a red flag because of the rain. So there is a practical solution, but again, I don't think you'd ever get 50% and keep an open wheel formula.
Yeah, their objective is to have them as things that can be bolted on in stoppages or red flags or before sessions, rather than kind of during the track being open. But this is all stuff to be worked out, and they may find a solution that can be done even more quickly. They're saying maybe a 5 to 10 minute kind of thing. Currently, they're mounted direct onto the upright with some kind of support. So there's still a lot to be done. They are going to do a version 2. Tom Bassis said that they're hoping to test that in the autumn, and they're still pushing on with it. I have to say, although we were joking about being slightly surprised that they underestimated the scale of the challenge, but I do think it's laudable that the FIA are doing this work properly. They're doing a lot of CFD analysis. They're setting an ambitious target, one that might be impossible, but you never know, it might be possible. You never know until you really work through it. So I like the fact they're being rigorous and analytical and saying, right, we've got this thing we would love to do, and if it could stop a repeat of Spa 21, that would be brilliant. And they're not setting a specific timeline on it. They're saying, right, we want to do it as soon as possible, but they're not throwing some idea in the rules and saying, right, we'll make it work, or just sort of half-baking it as they might have done a few decades ago, just make a change and hope it works. They're really putting the work and the effort into it. And I would say, even if this project fails, then it will have succeeded insofar as it's posed the question, can we do this effectively? And the answer is, actually, no, it's not possible. If that's the right answer, great. The key is you get the right answer at the end of the process.
Yeah, I mean, we always must move forward. And I mean, typical example is seat belts or the halo system or, rollover bars or whatever. They've all developed through time to be what they are now. So you never, quite get it 100% in the first hit. But what I'm saying is that you can set your ambitions too high as well. So sometimes it's better to accept a little, and then get on with developing it. Now, no matter what you do, it will have consequences to the car's aerodynamics. It's a bit like the old Porsches you used to get where the headlights popped up at night. At night, nobody could see the aerodynamics or the clean lines over the bonnet, so it didn't really matter too much. In this case here, you don't want to be popping these things on and suddenly there's a massive aerodynamic shift, because in the wet, that's not what you want. Normally in a wet condition, really, if it goes from dry to wet, you drop a lot of front wing off the car, because you don't want the car to be oversteery. So you need to be very careful with something like that around the rear wheels. It's not going to affect the diffuser dramatically, which will affect the rear downforce, so on and so forth. So needs to be a big warning sign put up for the teams, because your research is going to have to be done with these things off and these things on. And what does that do to your aerodynamic testing restrictions? Do you get more because of that? Because you're going to have to research two different levels of car. It's got consequences. It needs to be looked at carefully.
Yeah, I think the principle they're aiming for is that it'll be disruptive, but because it's a spec part, it'll either be put out to tender or it'll be a prescribed design, that it'll be the same for everyone. But of course, not everyone's car's the same. So it will inevitably have a bit of a different influence on every car. So there'll be a bit of pushback from teams about that. But given it's a design that's only meant to be used a few times a season for when it's the most wet, it's not just as soon as there's water on the track they put them on. I think they're willing to have quite a high tolerance for that. So, yeah, we'll see how they go with it. And, yeah, it's going to be a while before we see those. The absolute earliest we would see them will be next season. And I'd be quite surprised at this stage if they were ready for the start of next season, for example. So let's just wait and see how things go. And who knows, Gary, maybe they'll listen to this and take your idea on board. And we'll have a piece on the race website later in the week on that, with a few sketches and hopefully an illustration that can show people in detail what you're talking about.
You're listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Aramco continuously push the limits of engineering excellence. As the global energy partner of F1, they drive a shared vision to real-world innovation that aims to lower emissions, enhance performance and accelerate human potential. Aramco, powered by HAL.
For part 2 of the podcast, it's worth us trying to untangle some of the performance patterns we've seen recently in Formula 1. But to start with, it is worth reflecting on Red Bull, which is the undisputed number one. Max Verstappen's Hungarian Grand Prix victory was a record-setting 12th consecutive win, and that eclipses the mark set by McLaren in 1988 when they won 11 in a row before the infamous Italian Grand Prix when Ayrton Senna tangled with one-off Williams driver Jean-Louis Schlesser while lapping him at the start of the penultimate lap. So what do you make of that achievement, Gary? 12 wins in a row.
Well, it's amazing, really, but, we've got to look, it's a very, very different time. Back in 1988, reliability was a major issue for a lot of teams. So there was McLaren, not to take anything away from McLaren and their the wins they achieved in that year. It was one of these sort of situations where finishing the race was a hurdle. So the McLaren did a very good job in what they did at that point in time, but it's just a different era. Now everything is sort of tested, researched, whatever in the factory. So you're going to a race, knowing that probably all things being equal, you'll finish it. You won't have a reliability issue. So that obviously helps. But on saying that, and the competition is also a lot closer than it was, back in the 88. But the competition, it's a lot closer, but it stays close, if you know what I mean. There's not the big variation that you used to see as well. McLaren's car in 1988 was incredible, but the sort of challengers there was a big gap to the challengers, I suppose you might call it. Now that big gap's not there anymore. We're talking, hundredths of a second and thousands of a second in some cases. So it's very easy to just trip up and lose a race because of the competition level. But Red Bull, they've really worked hard on everything they've done as a racing team to do it well. That's from the DRS, from the car itself, from the DRS, from the engine package, the way they've got it now, the pit stops. They have control over everything, really. They are involved in everything that's going on in their car, and that shows, I think, and that's the thing about it. 12 in a row is pretty impressive, no matter what happens. A, because of reliability, and B, because of keeping the competition at bay. So all around, I think they've done a fantastic job. But it's a different era to when McLaren achieved that.
Yeah, very, very much so. And there is the possibility that Red Bull could do what McLaren came so close to doing, basically a couple of laps away from doing in 1988, and win all the races this season. I mean, I've been saying that's pretty unlikely, but that's 11 down, 11 to go, because the first race of that 12 race streak was Abu Dhabi last year. So it's perfectly possible. I keep saying that there'll come a point where they trip up or there'll be an engine penalty or something will go wrong for them. But I'm always surprised it hasn't happened, given there've been so many races where Sergio Perez hasn't been there, so their insurance card hasn't been there. So let's see if they can do it. Certainly, I'm sure internally it'll be a target for the team. But obviously, Red Bull are pushing on as well. They had an upgrade package at the Hungaroring that was effectively focused on cooling, but had some other benefits. Clever use of the development opportunities presented within aerodynamic testing restrictions, regulations and evidence, though, wasn't there?
Yes, I mean, it's always a difficult thing. Whenever you're trying to develop a car, the difference in developing something and as I call it, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, which you would say was what that Red Bull development was, is different from whenever you're sort of researching a different concept. And the people you have doing it as well. Obviously what we see is that Red Bull, they seem to have a pretty good handle on how their car works aerodynamically, how they want it to work aerodynamically. And all they're doing is sort of exploiting it a little bit further. So if we just take the changes they had in their car, which is mainly the radiator intake area, in my book, they've just exploited it a little bit further. Step 1 to step 2 to step 3. Step 1 was a bigger radiator intake, taller and narrower. Then for Baku, I think it was the slightly wider, slightly shallower, so getting more like a letterbox. And then this version in Hungary, again, a bit more of a letterbox as such. That's just taking what your theory is of the airflow there and your flow visualization that you do at the circuit and, looking at it and thinking, how could I exploit this a little bit further? So for Red Bull to optimize that radiator intake, it might have taken one wind tunnel session or 2 wind tunnel sessions, at the most. Whereas another team trying to come up with that Red Bull intake concept might take 10 or 12 wind tunnel sessions to optimize it because they're changing direction. So I think it's sort of the way the regulations are and the way that Red Bull's understanding are, it sort of plays into their hands. I can see them able to develop the car without the wind tunnel research that some other teams would have to do, without the wind tunnel time that some other teams would have to, because they've got a better handle on what they've got, to begin with.
Yeah, and we should note that any advantage they're taking of the ATR in terms of the fact you can do some of the internal stuff outside of it, there's nothing, it's not exploiting a loophole, it's nothing sneaky, it's just what the rules allow, and they're being sensible and practical with the way they apply what they're doing. So absolutely the right thing to do. Just shows how you've got to look at every angle. But that group behind's really interesting, isn't it? Because you've got McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari and Aston Martin who have been in that group. McLaren have joined recently. Aston Martin are looking a little bit in danger of moving out of it the way they're going. Very difficult to untangle. I guess the takeaway from the weekend is that McLaren is firmly in the game because it thrived at a track that didn't play as well to its supposed strengths as Silverstone did. So big positive for McLaren.
A big positive, yes. But I mean, and for the two drivers, whenever you consider how Oscar Piastri is driven, being a rookie, it's quite incredible. I think he'll have learned a lot from Hungary, because Hungary isn't just about speed. Come the race, it isn't just about speed, it's about looking after the tyres. It's one of the hardest on tyres there is to keep them alive, and obviously he struggled a little bit with that. But that's experience, that's understanding it, because once the tyres overheat with you, you're struggling, and you can't slow down enough to actually, get and come back underneath you again. So that's an experience thing about how you drive the tyres. But on the way there, he showed the speed that McLaren will want to have from him. But as you say, two circuits completely different, Silverstone and Hungary, and the car was there with Norris on the podium in second position twice. So they seem to have leapfrogged everybody else. To the extent that, starting the season badly, they learned a lot, but they bit the bullet and got on with it. As far as the changes to the car were concerned, the team now is working very well, both back at the factory and at the track. So I think that because of that learning curve coming from where they were in the doldrums, the first few races, they've sort of got their aerodynamic philosophy in their heads sorted out as to what direction they want to take, which direction they want to go in, how they want to take the car there. And it's about that more than anything else. It's about the aero platform and how you manage that aero platform. It's not just about getting a higher load aero platform or moving the centre of pressure or whatever. It's just about managing that centre of pressure shift and trying to get the best out of it between low speed and high speed corners. And I think they've got a handle on top of that. I think it's still, still lacking a little bit here and there, when it comes to the race, because at the end of the day, it was a fairly straightforward race. Verstappen still won from Norris by 33 seconds. So that's a pretty big gap. And we also don't know what was left in Verstappen's tank, because I think that there's a little bit more there if push come to shove. But was that 0.2 or was it half a second lap? Who knows? Because his fastest lap was a second faster than anybody else in the race. So the Red Bull still has that dominating factor. But I'm sure McLaren are embarrassing Mercedes a little bit for the fact that they've got there. Yeah, Lewis was on pole in Hungary, but then George Russell was on pole in Hungary last year in the Mercedes. So, something suits the Mercedes around Hungary in new tyres and qualifying trim. It did it last year, it did it this year. But as for the rest, I think, as I say, I think McLaren are the ones that are, I wouldn't say they're going to keep Red Bull honest, but they are going to be, somebody that Red Bull will be keeping an eye on in their mirrors as such. Mercedes, I think, from day one when Lewis was saying Friday that he couldn't drive the car, and the worst car he's ever driven, to being on pole the next day and totally jubilant in tears about it, to be honest, shows there's something amiss there, really, I think. Something definitely amiss in their understanding of how the car works. And it's not just about getting the best out of it and being on pole, it's carrying that through the weekend. And obviously it didn't happen. He finished fourth. Yes, he had a competitive race, but it was a long way off beating a Red Bull. The thing with Ferrari is, they could be anywhere. They could be on the front row, 2 cars, or they could be out in Q1. And to be honest, I think as a team, they're just the same as the viewers. We're watching it and thinking, what's going to happen today? Because something will happen. And their choices and their strategies and that are always a bit questionable here and there. Sometimes they get it right, but most of the time they get it way wrong. So they've got a lot of work to do in tidying up their act, I suppose you might call it. And again, Aston Martin, it's sad to see it, but they started the season so strong, and it did look for a while like they were going to be, a potential challenger. But I think it's one of those sort of situations. It's always difficult when, they've definitely gone the, and I'm wrong in saying this probably, but they've definitely gone the Red Bull clone route at the beginning of the year, and most of their top end designers and whatever came from or had Red Bull experience, so they brought along the Red Bull philosophy with them, and that's okay until you have to stand on your own 2 feet and take it somewhere else, and that's whenever it becomes difficult. So now I think we've got this situation where Aston Martin need to prove that they know how to take the car forward themselves, which is really what McLaren are doing. They've sort of got themselves to a point where, yes, they've followed the direction of the Red Bull, but they still had to do it, of their own bat. So they just had to buy into the fact that we need to go find out why the Red Bull works so well, and then try to exploit that as best possible from what we know and understand of our car. And that's what they're happy doing. And I think the biggest thing is Mercedes are shy about biting the bullet and going that whole hog and are really buying into the concept. Every time we hear from Toto, it's about, well, we tried the Red Bull solution and it doesn't produce the downforce we've got. But obviously there's someone that's doing pretty good for Red Bull.
Yeah, definitely a must do better for all those. It was interesting, Aston Martin, because before the race and after qualifying, they were quite upbeat because they were saying, well, actually, if you look at percentage deficits, it's not that big, it's okay. A few other teams have developed as well and are taking us on, but we're not too worried. We haven't lost ground. But then after the race, I had a chat to Mike Crack, their team principal, and he basically said, no, that actually this is a reality check, because they were expecting to be stronger in the race. They thought they'd done the usual Hungaroring thing of giving away a little bit on Saturday and then they'd have a much stronger race car on Sunday. Then they had a pretty good race and it's P9, P10, and that was really it. They didn't have the pace to do anymore. And I think that was a reality check in the purest sense, in that Sunday morning they thought things were going okay, but Sunday after the race, they thought, actually, we've got a bit of work to do here. So, yeah, interesting to see how things go for Aston Martin in the second half of the season. Well, if you're listening to this podcast, you understand the value of asking questions. At Aramco, answering questions helps them engineer a better future. So if you'd like to know how something works in F1, please send us a question to answer on a future episode of this podcast. It can be on absolutely anything, F1, ancient or modern, a technical question you always wanted to know the answer to. And as I always say, there's no question too simple or too complicated? Although I try and take the simple ones and Gary the complicated. And actually, very much Gary is the man with the answer. So you can send us a written question to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. Or if you prefer, record a voice note and send it to us, letting us know who you are in the voice note, and we'll play it in the show. Our first question today comes from Jacob from Australia, who says, McLaren has been talking about their wind tunnel coming. It feels like years. How does having your own wind tunnel help, and why does it take so long to build one? Of course, that wind tunnel project pretty much complete now.
Yes, pretty much complete. Well, a wind tunnel itself, it's a massive structure. And obviously for McLaren, they're increasing its size, they're increasing its capabilities, I suppose is the best way of putting it. Now, the thing about the wind tunnel is because of the wind tunnel restrictions, you want to get as much out of every wind tunnel run as you possibly can, much information. So it's all about the data logging and running through the process of moving the model around. Obviously, the ride height changes down the straight have to be all logged. You get data at every point. You'll do steering checks, you'll do roll, yaw. So you'll take a car through a corner as such. You'll take a car down the straight and through a corner, and you'll get a load of data on it. You'll do various different steering locks for slow speed corners, high speed corners, and that's all needs to be done by just the press of a button. And then there's just a massive pile of data that comes out, and that needs to get filtered and look at the car and try and do a sort of trace of what the centre pressure is doing as the car goes down the straight. What the drag's doing go down the straight mainly, but centre pressure as well. What the centre pressure does during braking, corner entry, mid-corner and exit for various different speed corners and different steering angle corners. So it is a very important piece of kit. It's a bit like, I don't know, I suppose, buying yourself a new dishwasher or washing machine or something and going up to there and looking at all these buttons, trying to figure out how to make the thing work. Not easy by any means, and I say you multiply that by about 10,000, and that's what you've got with a wind tunnel. It's one of those things where having your own wind tunnel means you always need to recognise its sort of shortcomings, because there will be shortcomings, whether it be how the effect of the front wing is relative to ground clearance or the underflow relative to ground clearance. It'll always be a little bit of a shortcoming. If you've got your own wind tunnel and you can understand it, then you get better results from it. It's one of those sort of things where you need to just make sure you understand what you're getting and how it reacts to the circuit. So, yeah, it takes a long time, a lot of money. I mean, a wind tunnel back in my day, I remember we got costings to build one at Jaguar, and I think it was $28 million at that point in time. Now you can probably multiply that by 10 or 5 at least, I suppose, before you get what you want. And so it's a lot of money, a lot of time, but when you've got it, it's your own little baby, and you can use it to suit what you need to. I think it's, this is where the sort of wind tunnel testing regulations come in, and I'm not sure that it's the right thing to do to restrict wind tunnel time. If you want to spend the money on a wind tunnel, which everybody has nowadays, you should be able to run that wind tunnel, a certain amount of hours per day, not necessarily 24 hours a day, but just, a certain amount of hours. There shouldn't be these restrictions that are there, really, because it's a bit of an artificial way of trying to put a bandage on a team using its tools to do a better job. And we've seen that bandage now on Red Bull, and it's not working. So it's not necessarily about the tool. The tool's part of it, but it's about having the people and the vision to sort of take your aerodynamic package and move it forward. Because the tool, the wind tunnel, is just the answer at the end of a spreadsheet. It's what you put in there that gives you those numbers, and that's the important thing.
Our next question comes from Charlie Wigglesworth, who said, I've been wondering recently about why today's, and since 2014 and the return of the turbos, F1 cars have airboxes above the driver's head, while the turbo cars of the 1980s almost never had these. I understand that a naturally aspirated engine benefits from the pressure generated by having this intake in this position, and I think the older turbo cars didn't need this, as they could generate all the pressure they needed with a turbo, presumably drawing air in through the side pod intake. So my question is, why did designers not feel the need to put the top-mounted airboxes on the cars then, and why do they all have them now?
Well, yeah, regulations have changed a little bit through time, and so it's quite interesting. If it wasn't necessary to have an engine cover, you probably would look at other avenues. But you've got a rollover bar regulation, which is where the rollover bar is. We've seen that on the Sauber interpretation with sort of single pillar and two side intakes, or the triangular roll bar, which most cars have of some sort. But the regulations changed quite a few years ago because people were doing away with engine covers, which meant that the old team principal had nowhere to put a sticker from a sponsor on it. And that's sort of, got the fin in the back of the engine cover that you see on all the cars now, I think, is part of that regulation where there's an area where you have to have bodywork. And because you have to have bodywork up there, which, as I say, the team principal can get a sponsor for, then you use it for something. And basically, it's the same old deal, the way the whole thing has sort of evolved. It's there for maybe the wrong reasons, but it's still there. It does two jobs now. It's pointless having that bodywork up there. It has to have a width. It's a triangular section. It has to have, from the side, it has to be a certain size. So it means that everybody has to have an engine cover of some sort, again, for the sponsor. And then you might as well use it for something. Now, a lot of the cars now they've got a lot of cooling fed by the rollover bar as well. So you'll see three holes, one in the middle probably for the turbo and one on each side for cooling the hydraulics or an intercooler or something. And that's because, the car's downforce-wise, the side pod inlet is critical to the airflow that helps generate downforce. Up above the driver's head there, above the helmet, in that triangle, it's not so critical. So, the compromise of the centre of gravity height by putting radiators on top of the engine, is outweighed by the fact that aerodynamically you can make the car more efficient. So you might as well use that as an intake up there for the turbo and for some cooling, and exploit, like Red Bull have done for the last race, the radiator intake, mainly minimise it as best possible to generate more downforce in the car. It's just a compromise. Everything's a compromise. So, you take your stab at it best possible and get the best out of the car just downforce-wise.
It was interesting that when the last turbo era ended, so 1989, Ferrari, John Barnard, the famous Ferrari 640, that of course won its first race early in that season. I'm going to say up until Mexico. That's from memory, so it could have to be corrected. It actually didn't have a conventional high airbox intake. It had the sort of the side intakes, and I think that meant it didn't get the same ram effect and all that kind of thing. So it was just felt to be better and better for packaging. So that does show it's not quite such an automatic thing, doesn't it? It's interesting when there's when you do get this sort of convergence towards a standard style. Sometimes there's other ways to do it, and then sometimes everything gets baked in because then the regulations kind of work around that, and then suddenly that's just a fact of life for a car design. You couldn't get rid of it. Yeah,
I mean, it is, the time usually sort of goes around in a circle, I think, with the regulations and with the design. We see it quite often where something will pop back up again over the years, and there's nothing sort of stopping you from having an intake now that feeds the turbo somewhere else, but you do have to have that body area, as an airbox as such, because of the regulations. So why do you want to put something else on the car whenever the airflow across some other part of the surfaces is as important, if not more important, than taking your airflow from above the driver's head? Above the head there, the helmet's not the most aerodynamic piece of kit in the world. With the halo as well, we see all the little fairing trims that they put on the halo to try and tidy up that airflow. There's up at that height, there's a lot of stuff going on. So at the end of the day, you just try to manage it as best possible, and then it allows you to optimize the radiator intake, side pod undercut, all of that detail to catch the flow coming off the front wing, and make sure that you're managing that flow, which is much, much more productive to lap time than basically moving a small turbo intake. Whenever we look at the old airboxes, the normally aspirated engines, you were getting something like 25, 30 horsepower out of them at the end of a straight. But obviously that's just at the end of the straight when you've got maximum speed, high pressure. So it's one of those sort of situations that did work on a normally aspirated engine. The turbo shouldn't need it, but it still does get cooler and more consistent flow up there than it would do with the radiator intake. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but regulations usually define these sort of things.
And our final question actually is less of a question and more just filed under general correspondence. And actually, we mentioned this in passing on our last podcast, that we saw one of your creations, a Jordan 195, driving past us at Silverstone on a flatbed truck. And it turns out the owner, Steve Griffiths, is a listener. So we're delighted to receive an email from him telling us it was chassis 3. It spent a dozen years in the Peugeot Museum, apparently, before he bought it a few years ago. And Steve rebuilt and recommissioned it for demo use. Apparently that engine that let go in quite a big way, judging by the video we saw of it, proper old school smoky engine failure. That actual engine only had a couple of dozen miles on it, so quite painful. We probably should have been more sympathetic when we talked about it, and certainly would have been had we known we were being listened to. But does it give you some satisfaction to know so many of your cars are out there still entertaining fans and frustrating owners?
Yeah, frustrating owners. Yeah, join the frustration. I had a few of those myself. Actually, interestingly, I was up at Silverstone. I went to the museum with my grandkids this weekend, and there's a Jordan 191 in there, and it was nice to see it. And had a little sit on it and a couple of pictures taken. So it's nice to see those cars around, and that the 195 that Steve has, he's done a fantastic job on the rebuild. I was looking through the WhatsApp pages a little bit earlier, just with all the pictures, and I sympathise with you on the engine failure. I've seen a few of those myself, and I was reading about your air valve problem as well, and that was one of the major problems we had with the Peugeot at the beginning, was air valve problems, and it actually came from the heads filling up with oil, and the air valve system was hydraulic, and it was getting oil into the air side, and then just going solid and basically suffering the consequences that you have with your engine, where a head falls off a valve. But I'm not saying that was it by any means, but it's obviously very painful. And one of the things that Peugeot had at that point in time was a system where the engine would shut down if the air valve system started to leak. The engine would just shut itself down, or would shut its revs down. So it managed it. So you'd never really see too much blue smoke like you saw from yours, Steve. But you would, just the same thing. The engine didn't fail visually, but it failed as far as performance was concerned and as far as race results were concerned. But that was it was a funny little car, that, because we'd changed just from the 195 from the 194. The 194 had Brian Hart's lovely little V10 engine in it, and we went to Peugeot, and it should have been the best thing in the world. But Peugeot were so much more difficult to work with than Brian Hart, and they had a lot of problems, but they wouldn't admit to their problems, so it was very, very difficult to sort of get solutions to problems, and the air valve system was just one of them. But through time, it got there. It was nice to see that the second and third in Montreal with the 195 was a nice weekend with Rubens and Eddie Irvine. So yeah, wish you all the best with it. It looks really good. I'd love to see it sometime.
Yeah, it's great that these cars are out there. I did have a number of wonders through the little demo paddock they had with various F1 cars, and that Jordan was very, very nicely turned out, although there was always a lot of that work going on around the back of it, unsurprisingly. So again, that was a familiar scene, but it's great because that's what these cars are there for. It's nice when you see them static, as you say, Jordan 191 in a museum, but racing cars belong on track, don't they? And it's great to see them, even if you do sometimes get the slight risk. Obviously, you may have seen from the Goodwood Festival of Speed last weekend. There was or the weekend before rather, there was a 1990 Leighton House that had an incident, shall we say, which is a bit painful, but also it's kind of what these cars are for, isn't it? It's nice to see them in action, even if it does sometimes go wrong or get very expensive sometimes. Yeah,
I mean, that's going to happen. That's motor racing. Sometimes it will go wrong, and it's it is very expensive. It's one of those sort of situations, I think, where keeping those cars running is very important to understanding where it's come from. And again, going back to the Jordan 191 sitting at Silverstone, in the museum, it was sitting beside a Red Bull. I forget what year Red Bull it was, but the Red Bull just looked massive, absolutely massive beside the Jordan. And whenever we were running the 191, it was a massive car as such for us. So it was quite interesting to see that. But looking through the 195 Facebook pictures and just looking at the front suspension, the dampers and the front anti-roll bar and the third spring mechanism, it's just so nice to see the detail, and it reminds you of what you did. So that sort of stuff, I think, is always quite good fun to just click the old brain again and say, oh yeah, I remember that. That was good fun. But yeah, as I say, all the best with it, Steve. It's going to be painful, but I'm sure you'll see through the pain and get it back together again. And I'd love to see it sometime.
Yeah, well, thanks to Steve for keeping the Jordan 195 going, as much of a battle as that as that seems to be at the moment. And thanks for dropping us a line. Yeah, it was. It's always great to see those cars. And at Silverstone, talking about that evolution they had, I think the oldest car they had was a Cooper T51. They had a T51 and a T53, which was the 59 and 60 championship winners with Jack Brabham, all the way up, I think, to a 2002 Jordan. So in a few paces, you get the whole evolution, which is great to see. And with a bit of luck, hopefully we'll see that Peugeot 195 chassis number 3 in action again sometime down the line. Well, thanks very much, Gary. And if you've got a question for Gary, remember to send it to podcast@therace.com. That's podcast@the-race.com, because we do really enjoy tackling your questions or observations or general correspondence. If you've got an old F1 car that Gary's responsible for, or even a non-F1 car that Gary's responsible for, there's a few Ansons out there. I saw one of those at Snetterton a few weeks ago. Drop us a line. Yeah, thanks very much for listening. Thanks, Gary. We'll be back in a few weeks with the next edition of the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. You've been listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Be sure to like, follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode.
The Athletic.